facilities here are forward if you want to attend, and you should. The annual meeting, you need to go to the Founders Room or the theater. Right, Beck?
Yep. Correct.
If you're an employee of the Hill and want to wear a mask, I'm not an employee of the Hill and I don't want it.
I'll wait till I leave. I don't care what you do.
One other final thought before I get started, and I've said this before, we're sort of coming to the end of this series, and I'm definitely going to take a break till after the first of the year, but I welcome any input on subjects that you might be interested in, that you think I might want to do something. I will do something, but I'm not sure, and any input you can give, like the election of 2028, or what climate will be in 2060, or things like that. But seriously, any input, anytime, I'm very much welcome. So today we're going to talk about something that trained historians shy away from. Individuals, people, and their impact on history. You know, we're taught it's economics, it's religion, it's military movements, technology, race, revenge, ethnic conflict, and all of those things are absolutely 100% true. However, sometimes an individual plays a role that is beyond the ordinary. And sometimes they play what turns out to be a crucial role. And so it was the case with Washington. I think that any American historian listing the top presidents would always list Washington, Lincoln, Lincoln, Washington, Washington, Lincoln, Lincoln, so on and so forth, and for very good reason. So today what I want to do is I want to explore with you Washington, and I want to explore him in different than the statue or the name of the high school or the state. And he becomes a marble figure, and he wasn't. He was very much a breathing human being. He was vain, and he was ambitious, and he was very vain, and he was very ambitious. So, given the fact, and I'll substantiate this in a moment, what I want to explore is how somebody with a huge vanity and huge ambition became what he actually did become, the cliche, the father of this country. Washington was born into a very wealthy family in Virginia, a planting family. He became fatherless at a pretty young age, but he was always aware of his physical appearance. He was about 6'2", when the average height of the average male, nobody measured them, okay, was probably 5'7", 5'8". So he was imposing. In addressing Washington, the average male, whether it was Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, was doing this. And that carries power with it. And he knew that he was physically imposing. He took great pride on the fact that he was physically imposing, and he hid very successfully any physical flaws that he might have had, and we'll come back to the story of his spectacles later on to address something that Ann Cantor mentioned last week. He was also regarded by his peers as the premier horseman in all of Virginia. And there's a story about an English visitor to Virginia who was questioned about how the trip to Virginia went, and he said it was absolutely delightful. All the gentlemen basically talked about cockfighting, horseback riding, and alcohol. Horseback riding was really, really important in one's physical appearance and the approbation of one's peers. And his peers, obviously, were the fellow planters, and he became, after his marriage to Martha Custis, she was a widow, as you may recall, had 2 small children who he basically adopted, one of the wealthiest men in the country. She had vast holdings, vast land holdings. And the land holdings were part and parcel, as I'll mention in a couple of moments, of his ambition. But he was not only regarded as the epitome of a gentleman by his peers, but also by the ladies of the time, because he was a superb dancer and he loved to dance. Now, most men, I don't know about those in this room, but standing up here I can speak for my wife and saying that her husband is not enamored of dancing, but he was a great dancer, and he took pride in it. Now, he was an ambitious man, and I said, the initial ambition was a military career. And he sought a British commission, but he was a colonial. Colonials didn't get commissions in the British Army. You got commissions in the British Army by being connected in one respect or another to the British nobility and paying for your commission. But he was a colonel in the Virginia militia, and as a very young man, as happens to some young men, he sought glory, and he acted with great physical bravery. In fact, he saved the life of General Braddock in the battles with the French that began the famous French and Indian War. Like most Virginia planters, he was land hungry. And you may recall way, way, way back that I had mentioned that land was the primary source of wealth. So you got more land, you got wealthier. You became more powerful politically. And he was a speculator in Western lands, and one of the things he learned, even as a young man, before getting into the military, was to be, I'm losing the word, surveyor. Sorry, that happens. And he was a surveyor of the Western lands. Well, Western lands, I meant what today is West Virginia or the western parts of Virginia. He was also a speculator in lands. So jumping way ahead, when it was clear that the capital of the United States was permanently going to be moved to the Potomac, and that Virginia and Maryland were going to cede land to create the District of Columbia, he gobbled up as much land as he could get, knowing in advance that this was going to be the capital, and the more land he had there, the wealthier he would be. So he was a vain man, and he was an ambitious man. And this was an era, as we have repeatedly seen, where there was among Americans a pervasive fear of power, a pervasive fear in particular in the power that would be ceded to an individual. Remember, Americans were theoretically revolting against a tyranny, whether it was the tyranny of the British government or eventually the tyranny of George III. There was a decided fear of power corrupting, and as Lord Acton in his famous quote said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there was no doubt that there was a complete fear of this. So now, let's explore why Washington secured power which was given to him voluntarily. And to do that, we need to look into the character of the man. The character beyond the vanity and the character beyond the ambition, although those two were there. One could even go so far as to say the vanity was a key element along with the ambition in the manifestation of the characteristics that appealed to others, so much so that they were willing to grant him the kind of power he came to acquire. He was in control, self-control. At age 14, he writes in his diary and copies out a book of maxims, 101 maxims on how to behave, how to appear, how to actually carry himself at age 14. And this begins the process of the self-control that he exhibited. He exhibited self-control over his own emotions. He had a really bad temper. But except on two rare occasions in the war, he never exhibited temper. He kept control. He kept an ideal that he appealed to in all of his behavior, all of his life, characterized by this concept of disinterestedness. Now, today, in our use of that word in the language, it tends to mean not interested. That was not what it meant in the 18th century. It did not mean that I didn't have an interest in the subject or the issue that was presented. In fact, I had an interest, whether it was land or military glory or whatever. I had an interest. I knew what my interest was, but I was capable of rising above my own interest. Contrast this, not just simply 2021, for the rest of our history. How many political figures can you think of who, knowing their own interest, tried successfully to look at both sides, to be above his own interest, to be open to the other point of view, to actually listen and not talk. In fact, one of his strongest characteristics was silence. That, and along with a willingness to listen to subordinates, a willingness to delegate, That was power. That was power by constraining your own interests, by never appearing to want power, never appearing to grasp for it, with one exception. You will recall that I mentioned that in the Congress, which he was a delegate, he wore his uniform in the Virginia militia. What did that signal? I am interested in a military role. But he never opened his mouth. He never asked. He never saw. He sat silent. It was there. Others knew it. But the lust for power never manifested in a way that was threatening to others. And I think I said last time, and if I didn't, I'm saying it now, that the way he became commander-in-chief was through the efforts of John Adams. It wasn't that John Adams saw the man sitting there in the uniform. I mean, in all my descriptions of Adams and all of his brilliance, he was a pretty snarky guy, a very jealous person, also quite brilliant. And he understood that Virginia, as the largest state by population, largest state by wealth, had to be represented at a significant level in the military that was being created. In fact, the person who had the most military experience was this colonel from Virginia. So it was Adams who nominated him. In response to being nominated, he said nothing. He was silent. And when the Congress voted to make him commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, his response was modest, grateful, and humble. He acknowledged the honor of being made commander-in-chief. And he said then and there, I will do my very best. Every day I will do my very best. But I don't know, frankly, if I am up to the task you've charged me with. So I apologize in advance for any failures in my ability to achieve what we need to achieve. But I will dedicate myself, every part of myself, to doing the best I can. And he meant it. So I haven't mentioned yet sincerity. But think for a moment who was sitting in the Congress when he was given the commission to be commander-in-chief. Well, we know Adams was. We know Jefferson was. We know Franklin was. We know Light Horse Harry Lee from Virginia was. We knew Benjamin Rush was. We knew that sitting there were some of the most astute, politically knowledgeable people there were, not just here, but throughout the Western world. And they believed him. So when he said that he takes this responsibility but refuses to take any salary, the impact was very real. Yes, Tom, how can we help you, sir?
What time will this be over, Stan?
Probably 11 o'clock tonight.
I'll be back.
Just keep circling. About 5.
Okay.
Couple of minutes, one way or the other.
Only Tom could get
We
away.
want to make sure that you see, this is being recorded, so if somebody sees this years from now, I don't know when they would, they're going to wonder, what was that? So he had already, by this time, by the time he receives the commission as commander-in-chief, had already commanded the respect of Spears. Because what they were giving him was basically ultimate power without constraint. And what do I mean? Remember last time when we were talking about organizing the war, I made the point that unlike our tripartite form of government with the judiciary and legislative branch and executive branch, there was no Confederation judiciary, there was no Confederation executive. I used to kid people, who was the first president of the United States? And I mean, George Washington. The first president of the United States was actually John Hancock. He was president of the Congress. There was no executive. But now there was. Now there was an executive officer, the commander-in-chief of the army. And what control or constraint was placed upon him by the Congress? You got it? None. He was commander-in-chief, so the troops move left, your troops move right. Whatever power, physical power, to resist the British, other than the state militias, which were important, but whatever power could be mobilized by this new confederation was in his hands. He could succeed, he could fail, he also could do something else. He could use the army to seize total power. He could be a Caesar, win all the battles, defeat the British, and, who's on top now? So when he was given command, somebody obviously had to be given command, but when he was given command, into his hands, with the support of his peers, went the confidence that he would not abuse that power. That power was there for a single purpose: to carry on the war to a successful conclusion. Congress is now going to modify the War Powers Act, but we know that our recent presidents, going back at least to Franklin Roosevelt, use the military in ways they think is important for the national security, not too often asking Congress's permission, although the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. But there was no Constitution. Well, no, what it was Confederation. So this man now is given power. Washington, because of his self-control, because of his experiences with the British and the British military, because of his sitting and listening in the Continental Congresses he attended, had developed a level of political astuteness at least equal to, and I think I can make the argument legitimately greater than anyone else in America. And by political astuteness, I mean a sensitivity to what was actually going on in the country. So he was deliberate in his understanding that his role required him to be subservient to the authority of the Congress, to listen to what the Congress instructed him. So, as I said before, well, he could tell the army to go left, and he could tell the army to go march over the right. But he had to follow what the Congress said, and he understood that without being subservient and taking orders from the Congress, he would endanger civil control of the military. I'll give you a simple example. After Boston, after the British get kicked out of Boston because the Americans, and we'll talk about battles next time, the Americans get these guns down from Fort Ticonderoga and put them on the Dorchester Heights in Boston. The British know they're going to destroy the British fleet. They pull out, and you knew the British coming back, or where are they coming back to? The obvious target is New York. And the Congress tells Washington to go and defend New York. He didn't think it was a good idea. We'll go into that when we talk about that. But that's what Congress told him to do. And guess what? He moved the army to defend New York. If you read his correspondence with Congress, he is always asking for supplies, asking for troops. In his relationship with the state governments, there's the same level of respect. Can I please have the state militia to work with? Can we please ask them to stay a little longer? And his first experience when he went up to Boston, actually to Cambridge, and he took over the army, as I've said previously, the New England militia elected their own officers. Now, what army in history elected this? It certainly wasn't his experience in the British Army. And what did he do? He respected their choice of their own officers, even though he disagreed with electing officers. He didn't say we have to change everything. He did change the system in the Continental Army, but not in the militias. So by his own behavior, in relationship to the civil authority, he understood his role was subservient, that the civil authority was the ultimate power. And when the French finally sent troops here, we'll also discuss that when we discuss battles, but the first thing the Americans wanted was, okay, come on, French troops, join us, we're going to attack New York, or we're going to attack wherever you're going to attack. And the history of the French troops in the United States during the Revolutionary War was primarily one of sitting on their rear end. They didn't move until 1781, when they moved with Washington to Yorktown. So he had to relate to a foreign ally who he could not command. He had to use all of his political astuteness and diplomacy with the French. And he was almost, not quite, but almost up there as a diplomat with Franklin. Throughout his life, he was exceedingly jealous of his reputation. That was part of his self-control, how others saw him. You could almost psychologically analyze him, or psychoanalytically analyze him, or whatever terminology you want to use. But the respect of others, the way he defended his reputation, put a control, a constraint, was the exercise of that self-control, which was manifest and was really a source of his power, because others saw in him somebody who was not hungry for power. There's a story, and it's not apocryphal, I think it's actually quite true. In the Washington administration, he had Hamilton and Jefferson to dinner one night, and the three of them were chit-chatting. And the subject came up, who is the greatest man in history? I don't know what Washington's response was, and I don't know what Jefferson's response was, but I do know what Hamilton's response was. Who is the greatest man in history? Julius Caesar. From that moment on, Jefferson saw Hamilton as power hungry, as a threat to be a dictator if he got sufficient power. That never occurred with Washington. No one ever thought for a moment that that's what this man's ultimate goal was. His ultimate goal was to go back to Mount Vernon. One of the remarkable things is in the middle of the war, in the middle of virtually every day, part of his correspondence was to the manager of his property, telling him, don't forget to plant the apple trees over here, and did you get 4 new horses over there, and how much flour did this mill make? I'm making up those kinds of, but the detail, he was obsessed is not the right word. He was obsessed, I guess is the word, with Mount Vernon, with going home. So I want to give you some examples of how he exercised the political astuteness that I just talked about. And again, we'll talk about battles when we get to the battle part of this. But we know, all of us have seen the portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware, with the ice. And it's actually, I don't know, it's not a photograph, obviously. But he really did cross the Delaware, really did attack Trenton. It was his idea on Christmas night, 1776, after suffering disastrous defeats in New York and being chased all over New Jersey, till he had to cross the Delaware, he understood the importance of a counterattack because he understood the fear among the political leaders of the country that the British were winning. He understood that he had to instill something special in his own troops to restore morale. He was acutely aware of what was going on. And we'll see that later when we talk about the Battle of Germany. He was acutely aware, as I just said, of the French, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, so those of you who know French, hauteur, this self-importance of the French noblemen who were here fighting. And he maintained the best possible relations with them without ever once assuming that same attitude. After Yorktown, there was really not much fighting going on. Yorktown was 1781. The peace treaty was signed in 1783. So what happened? Well, the British instructed, the British government instructed the British Army to undertake no offensive operations, and Washington just basically blockaded the British in New York. He was up in Newburgh, New York. That's where the headquarters were. Up in Westchester County, I think Newburgh is. Meanwhile, troops weren't getting paid. In fact, the officers weren't getting paid. The officers had been promised pensions and land. Hey, Colin, you could serve drinks to everybody.
Oh, I could.
But you're not going. They hadn't been paid. So the story was, how are we going to get paid? We're sitting around here, we're doing nothing, we're not fighting, we don't have any money. Congress has promised us all this stuff and hasn't delivered. And so what happened is, I don't know the exact number, but 50 or 100 of the officers get together and start talking about marching on Philadelphia and forcing the Congress to pay them, give them their pensions, and give them their land grants. And they decide to hold a meeting. These are the officers of the American Army, not to organize another petition to Congress, but to organize a march on Congress. And who unexpectedly walks in? And what I mean unexpectedly, nobody expected him. His aides didn't know but he knew they were meeting. He knew what was going on. And he walks in, and as all the officers do, when a senior officer walks in, they all stand up. They sit down. And he starts to pull out from his pocket a speech that he's going to read. He folds the paper, and then he pulls out from his pocket something nobody had ever seen. He pulls out spectacles. He had never allowed anyone, his closest aides, no one was allowed to see that he had to use spectacles. And he then tells them, I was there with you. I was in Boston, I was in New York, I was in Germantown, I was in Trenton. I was there in every fight. I was with you. And I believe the Congress will carry out its promises. Takes off the spectacles, puts them back in his pocket, folds the speech, puts it in his pocket, and walks out. In all of American history, that was the closest that the military forces ever came to subverting civil government. Talk about political astuteness. Now, he was, I guess, in some modern psychology called the alpha male. He was a leader, and the military wanted to be led by him, and the Congress wanted to be led. So in the face of victory, this was a people going back as far in their history as they could remember or ever heard myths about. They had a king. So, we get rid of one George. What's the obvious thing to do? We need a king. Washington was not the intellectual Jefferson or Adams were. He didn't have a college education. He was not the intellectual of Madison. He was not the incredible diplomat that Franklin was. But he believed as deeply as they did in the revolutionary concept put more eloquently 80-odd years later, power of the people, by the people, for the people. He never wanted to be a king. He never wanted to be a dictator. He never wanted to be a tyrant. So what does one do when one is the commander-in-chief of the victorious revolutionary army? What does one do? What are we going to do in retirement? Well, the Hill of White Marsh wasn't there. I think we would have welcomed him. What are we going to do? What does Washington do? rides down to Philadelphia, has a meeting with Congress and says, you know what? You gave me a commission. You appointed me commander-in-chief to carry out this mission. With God's good graces and the enormous efforts of all of our people, the mission is accomplished. Here is your commission. Now, there's a story, it probably is apocryphal, but even if it's not true, it's worth the story. Upon hearing that George Washington had turned back the commission, turned back all of his power, George III in Britain said, if that is true, he's the greatest man in the world. And that was the shocked opinion throughout all of Europe. Who had ever done such a thing? Well, there was one person way back in the time of the Roman Republic, a gentleman named Cincinnatus. That's another story for another series. But nobody, it just didn't occur to anybody that having power, I mean, he could have stayed as general-in-chief, who was going to throw him out? Without an executive, who was the person you were going to turn to? Who would you be asking, well, George, what do you think about this, and what do you think about that? And who was going to stand up against him? If he said move left or move right, then who was going to say no? And he retired to Mount Vernon. He really was finished with power. He really was overjoyed to be back at Mount Vernon planting apple trees. Except, and this is not to diminish him, he kept abreast of what was happening to the country. He was not unaware of the turbulence. And when they called the Constitutional Convention here in Philadelphia, who do you think was appointed to preside? The only person who could be counted on to be disinterested. The conflicts and clashes of the different philosophies and political ideas that carried the Constitution to fruition and under which we still live, and which there were vehement disagreements, who was the only person who could be trusted to preside? No wonder we have a state and high schools and colleges around the country named after this really remarkable human being. Thank you.
Tell me about his reputation for sleeping around, so to speak. I mean, everybody has been to some old house where Washington slept here. Is that true?
If we're talking about sleeping around in the sense of sleeping, yeah, I mean, he was traveling with the army all over the place. If we're talking about his reputation with ladies, there is really no indication that he was anything but deeply in love with Martha. I mean, it was an arranged marriage. It suited both families. politically and financially. But, and remember, she came to the marriage with 2 children, and they never had children together. And, you know, he didn't write how disappointed, and he adopted the kids. Yeah, there's no evidence that he philandered. I'm not saying he didn't, but nobody had a videotape of it. Nothing appeared on, what is it, CNN, anything like that. Any other questions? Yes?
What happened to the Army? Did they get paid?
Yeah, the Army eventually got from the Congress the land grants, which were basically their payment. I mean, they were given the officers. I can't speak about the individual troops because I just don't have that fact in my memory now. But the officers were given 500 acres here, 300 acres there, 700, right? They were given what was the essence of wealth in those days, land. I mean, there were very few tangible assets like gold, silver, or stocks or anything like that. So yes, they were paid. Congress coughed up after a whole bunch of delays and arguments and frustrations. Yes, Peter.
After he retired to Mount Vernon, he eventually became president.
Yes.
Can you discuss that in another talk about how?
Well, I think we can, again, I'm going to conclude this series of talks with the peace treaty of 1783, and I'm going to be asking a question. So this is the question, and you need to do your homework, at least your mental homework. How revolutionary was the revolution? How radical was it? What changed, what didn't change? But the conclusion of this series will be with the Peace Treaty of 1783 and that question, which will have more or less, I hope, an open discussion. As to what I do after the first of the year, I'm open to suggestions. I have some ideas, but I really would like to hear, first of all, I'd like to hear that you want me to continue these things. You might not, that's okay. And if you do, what you think you would be interested in hearing about. Al?
Were members of the Continental Army conscripted or volunteer?
No, there was no conscription. The first conscription in the United States was in July of 1863 in the Civil War, which then caused the New York City riots where huge numbers of people were killed.
So they were all volunteers?
Yes, they were all volunteers. All.
Were they
Good.
in any way paid for that?
Yes, they received pay. They received continentals, paper, script. There wasn't any, virtually any gold or silver. What was called for many, many decades, specie, S-P-E-C-I-E, was gold and silver coins. There were just not enough of it, so paper money was used. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you think, Washington was a slave owner?
Washington was a slave owner.
So were we ever going to take his statues
Yeah, I'm
down?
going to answer your question. I have a question. I'm going to answer yours, but I want an answer from the audience. Who is the only founder who was never a slave owner? Now, the rest of your question.
Does that mean that someday somebody's going to get the idea to come and take down all his statues?
Well, here's the question. Does that mean that in some day, somebody is going to come around with the idea of taking down all of Washington's statues? My answer is no, they're going to be a bunch of schmucks. But leave that aside. Washington, among the founders, was the only one in his will who freed his slaves. and provided funds for them. It wasn't, okay, on my death you're free, on my death you're free, and his buck seat and actually have a life. He could not legally free Martha's slaves. His slaves he could and did free. Jefferson, the great hypocrite, I mean, did I say hypocrite? We believe all men are created equal and endowed by all, but I don't mean really all. I don't mean people who are slaves. I don't mean black people. I don't mean women. I don't Catholics. But almost all. Some never freed a slave. Not one. Not even on his death. So Washington, yes, Washington was a slave owner. Any other, oh, hold it. You didn't answer my question.
All right.
Don't you dare try to get the correct answer. Okay, I know you know the answer. Do you have another question?
That was my question. Who was the only one who didn't know?
Okay.
Adams.
John Adams. Benjamin Franklin had a couple of slaves early on here in Philadelphia. Don't call whether he took one to London, but he quickly freed them and was one of the founders of one of the earliest abolition societies in the world. He was a vehement abolitionist. Any other questions?
When's your next lecture?
I'm sorry.
When is your next lecture?
Oh, is it next Wednesday?
Next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday. Then there'll be, this series will end in November, sometime in November. I'm not sure how I'm going to break it up a little bit. So if you have any suggestions, you can email me, you can talk to me over dinner, run to me, trap me, any suggestions. I'm open to suggestions. I have some ideas of my own, but I hear what you have to say. So once again, unless any more questions, not an issue. And? Oh, no. All right. Thank you. Yeah, okay, Mary Sue.
All right, so when was he put in charge of the Army? Was this before July 4th, 1776?
Oh, yeah,
They
in
were really-
17, yes, absolutely. I think, dates. I think it was May 1775, I think. Yeah, he was in charge of the Army in 1775.
So all this was going on, even though Britain was thinking they were in command.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk next time about the war itself. I have in my mind now 3 or 4 more talks. One on diplomacy, because it was crucial to American victory. One or possibly 2 on the battles. One of the problems I have is I get together with Rebecca Sheets. I don't know where she is now. Oh, there she is in the back. I want to see if I can find maps to use for some battles, because it's a little difficult in me describing it if you don't have
You can
something
buy as many
to look
maps
at.
as you want.
What?
You can buy as many maps as you want.
How much is the hill chipping it?
You know?
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
We know how much the hill is chipping. And that amounts to, okay, any other, I mean, seriously, I don't think any other questions. So feel free to come up and to chat and tell me what you think, but I see that we need to dismiss, and we have to Jimmy here yet?
He's coming.
He's on his way.
Let there be light.
And, oh yeah, Tina.
I'd like to see some of your projections. At one point, you were going to do some women.
I was going to do some what?
Women.
Not that dude.
Not that. It took me a long time to think of that, Stan. But you at one time point about doing Eleanor Roosevelt or a selection of women
Just
leaders.
giving you an idea.
Okay, that's certainly something.
And I think it would be fun to have one.
There is, we know that there's a majority of Hill residents who are of the estrogen.
No.
We have no
Estrogen-based white forms.
Estrogen's gone down.
Quite as much estrogen as it used to be, but, I mean, I certainly would entertain that and do, if you mention somebody, Eleanor Roosevelt, you know,
That would be
I
interesting.
mean, I could certainly do one.
She would take that.
And it may be that what you're interested in is just one talk on one subject.
Who's thinking?
And I don't want to share what my thinking is, because I tend to think it will
Ice cream.
That's not,
influence too much my self-regard and my constraint and my tall physique and my things like that.